Today we're learning how to do brioche stitch in the round. You can knit brioche flat or circular, and we're going to be doing it in the round today. And I'm going to be showing you how to do it with two colors. From an educational standpoint, it's easier to see what I'm doing with two colors. Everything that we do today, you do the same if you're doing in single color. So I have a single color brioche stitch here on the right and a two-color brioche stitch here on the left. This is the one we're going to be using for demonstration purposes. So let's talk a little bit about what brioche stitch is. It confuses a lot of people because it's not worked in a traditional way. It's worked kind of it's a stitch pattern that's sort of unique, a unique genre of knitting in its own. It's a really, really wonderful stitch pattern. Why do you work brioche? There's a few reasons in my mind why it's great. The first is that it's a really squishy fabric. It's got a lot of dimension and depth to it. And that's a really nice fabric to wear. Even though it appears like a rib, you see in the yellow I have my knit stitches, and in the gray would be where my purl stitches are. And if I flip this over, just like a regular rib, what's yellow and a knit on this side is falling into that purl ditch on the wrong side, and same for the gray. What's falling in the purl ditch on the wrong side is creating a knit column on the wrong side. So it's a reversible, completely reversible stitch pattern, which is also really fantastic. Great for anything that you're going to see the right side and the wrong side of while being worn. And as you can see in two color, it's also just a cool reversible fabric. You get a mirror image of the colors that you get on the right side and the wrong side when you're doing it with two colors. So that's pretty cool too. Another thing that I want to say about brioche stitch is that it's wider than regular knitting. So your stitch gauge is going to be different than what you might expect using a certain yarn and a certain needle size. I'm working here with a chunky yarn, and normally I would work this yarn on maybe a 9 or a 10. And for brioche stitch, I'm often working on a needle size one or two sizes smaller than I would normally work for regular knitting, just to account for that added width that you're going to get from this stitch pattern just by its nature. Even though it looks like one-by-one knitting, it's more similar to double knitting, which means you're knitting two different layers of fabric at the same time. And the reason that it's like double knitting is to make this stitch pattern, we have a 2-round repeat. So we're working the same 2 rounds over and over again. And the first round we're going to work with a single color, the yellow, and the second round we're going to work with the gray. And the reason it's like double knitting is that we're only actually knitting or purling half the stitches on any given round. So I would be working all the knit stitches on the yellow round and slipping all the purl stitches. And on a gray round, I'm working all the purl stitches and slipping all the knit stitches. So that's what's different about this than a regular one-by-one rib, is that it's a little similar to double knitting, and I'll show you how that works. So we're going to start here with a cast on. And as you can see, I've cast on here with the yellow yarn, just like I did in my hat. You can see my cast on edge on the hat is all worked in the yellow. And you always work your cast on with just a single color. And the setup round is going to be worked in the second color. And so the way that you work this setup round when you're working brioche, I'm set up here to start right with a knit stitch, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, all the way across. So to work your setup round, and it's a row here, but this will be for circular knitting, I'm going to start with slipping my knit, slipping the first stitch, purling the second stitch. So I got to join my yarn in here. And now every time, I'm just going to go around slipping the knits and purling the purls, but every time I slip a knit stitch, so I'm slipping one, notice that my working yarn's in the front. I'm leaving it in the front. I'm going to slip the stitch. I'm going to bring the yarn over top of my right needle and back through. So I basically just created a yarn over right on that stitch. And now I'm going to purl one. And I'm going to do that all the way around. So slip one purlwise, bring yarn over top and back around, purl one. slip one, bring yarn over and around, purl one. And this is what I'm going to do all the way around. Slip the yarn over, purl one, slip the yarn over, purl one. And I'm going to do that all the way around on that first round, or in this case, just to the end of my swatch. And what you end up with, if I stretch these stitches out, you'll see this is what you're always going to see as you're working in brioche. You're going to see a single stitch here, the gray. That's the stitch that I just worked. And then you're going to see a sort of a double stitch. It looks like there's a little X. The stitch that's yellow is the stitch that I slipped, so that's from the row below. And the yarn over in the gray is when I wrap the yarn around the needle. And this is how you set up. So when I start to knit here with my two-color brioche, you're going to see that every time I work into a row, I'm working into this setup, which is a regularly worked stitch and a stitch with a yarn over paired with it all the way around. So that's how you would cast on and work the setup row. And then after you've worked the setup row as this, we can jump right into working brioche in two colors, as I'm going to show you here on my piece that has a little bit more fabric. As you can see here on my left needle, it looks just like what I did over here. I have the purl stitches indicated here by the gray on the right side. Those are all looking like normal stitches because the last round that I worked was in gray and I was doing a purl, slipping one with the yarn over. And you can see where I have my yellow columns here, all of those have the yellow stitch that was slipped and the corresponding yarn over from the gray. So to make brioche stitch, it's a 2-round repeat. I'm going to be doing round 1 of the repeat in yellow and round 2 of the repeat in gray. And so you can see the first stitch I have is a knit stitch, and I see my yellow stitch with the corresponding yarn over from the round before. And I'm going to go ahead and knit that. So it feels like I'm doing a knit 2 together because I'm knitting the yellow stitch together with the gray yarn over from the round below. And that's a knit. It's really easy to see that it's supposed to be a knit because it looks like a knit stitch column below. Now I have a purl stitch in front of me and I'm going to do the slip. So I'm bringing my yarn to the front, slipping that stitch purl-wise. And now instead of bringing my yarn over and around like I did before, I don't even need to do that because I can just go right into the next stitch, this next knit stitch with its corresponding yarn over. I go into that next stitch, and as I bring my yarn around to knit it, you can see that because I had my yarn in the front, it automatically created a yarn over that slipped purl stitch that I was moving. So every time I do a knit, I bring my yarn forward, slip one, and then I just go straight in to the next knit stitch, and I knit it, and I'm making that yarn over. And once you get comfortable with brioche stitch, you'll realize how rhythmic it is. You get in this rhythm. It's very quick and hypnotic. So you see I'm bringing my yarn forward, slip one, and then knit those two together, and in doing so, create that yarn over. And so what I'm doing now as I work is basically creating the same thing I did with the gray with the yellow. So above the knit stitch columns, you see a regular yellow stitch, and above the purl stitch columns, you see a double stitch, the purl stitch in the gray with the corresponding yarn over in the yellow. And you do that all the way around. Okay, and now you can see that I'm coming up on my beginning of round marker. I put this big marker in there to make it really easy to see. And you can see that my second color is just sort of there waiting for me, the gray. So I've gotten to the beginning of the round, slipping the marker, and I'm going to drop my yellow yarn and I'm going to start working with my gray yarn. Now as you can see, this will be round 2 of the repeat. As you can see, now that I have my gray yarn here ready to go, I have just the opposite of what I saw from the round before. So above all the knit stitch columns, there's a regular single yellow stitch. And above all the purl stitch columns, there's a double stitch. So it's the slipped gray and the yarn over of the yellow. So very, very similar to what we just did. Round 2 looks like this. All the knit stitches get slipped, and be sure to slip everything purl-wise. So you're going to slip the knit stitch, yarns in front always when you're working the second round. And this time, because I'm purling this stitch, I have to go make the yarn over. So I'm making the yarn over and coming back forward. So you can see I went all the way around my right needle tip and out. You can see I've created that yarn over there. And then I'm going to purl these 2 stitches together. So this is the purl stitch and the corresponding yarn over from the round below. And that's all you do for round 2. So slip 1 purlwise, yarn over, bring the yarn back to the front, purl those 2 together. Slip 1 purlwise, yarn over and back to the front, purl 2 together. Slip 1, yarn over, purl 2 together. Now, as you're gathering, watching me do this, when you're counting your stitches, I have 60 stitches on my needle here. These double stitches, the stitch that has the yarn over on it, are always considered a single stitch. You'd never consider that 2 stitches. If I did, then I would have a crazy increase round if I was working those separately in any way. So in brioche, always think of those stitch pairs as one, and they always line up with a single column of stitches. So I'll go back all the way around doing this. Okay, and as you can see, I'm coming back to the beginning of the round, indicated by this big orange marker. And I just want to show you how to handle the beginning of a round. That can be one of the more fussy things in circular brioche knitting when you're just getting used to it. So what you can see is the last 2 stitches of my round are a knit stitch in the yellow and then a slip stitch of the purl with its yarn over. But you see that the yarn over is loose right now because since it's the last stitch in the round, I haven't actually worked this first knit stitch with my yellow yarn to secure that yarn over. So you're always going to have sort of a little bit of a floating yarn over there from the row below when you're finishing up round 2 like I am now. The end of round 1 ends with this sort of floating yarn over. So we're going to secure that right now when we start picking up the yellow again, but I just wanted to let you know that that will be floating there, and that might scare you at first, but that's normal. That's how it's supposed to be. And again, I also like using kind of a big marker with brioche. If you're using a small stitch marker here, it's kind of easy for the small marker to jump underneath one of these neighboring stitches, which just adds confusion that you don't need. So if you're new to this brioche in the round, I would recommend using a nice big marker that's not going to jump anywhere as you're working. So I've got my last 2 stitches of round 2 that I'm working with the gray. It's going to be a slip, bring yarn over and back through. And now, see, I want to make sure that when I knit this final stitch, I'm actually knitting it with the yarn over in the yellow. And so what I do on the last stitch is I just hold my yarn here, and so that I'm sure that when I'm going in, I'm going under both. And you can see when I purl that and come back out, I've got the yellow yarn has been worked. And now I'm going to slip my marker and proceed, drop my gray yarn and start in with my yellow again. Now that I'm on the first stitch of round 1 again, I've got my yellow yarn active, my gray yarn, I've dropped it. I'm going to just leave it there till I come around to get it again. Pick up my yellow yarn, I'm going to knit the first stitch together with its corresponding yarn over. Bring the yarn to the front, slip 1, that's the purl stitch. Go in and to knit these again, knit it. As you see, I did that, I created the yarn over, and so on and so forth. And you just repeat those 2 rounds over and over again, and you'll start to see this beautiful 2-color stitch pattern shaping up. And it's the reverse on the wrong side. And the basic 2-round stitch pattern that you need to create brioche. A couple other quick tips I want to give you. First is, now that you've seen me demonstrate, you can see why it's easier to use 2 colors when you're starting out, because you know that yellow is always for round 1, gray is always for round 2, and if you put your knitting down and you go away and you come back and you forget where you were at, it's much easier with the 2 colors to know, oh, I was on round 1 or a knit round, or I was on round 2, a purl round. But if we were knitting this in a single color, just the yellow or just the gray, we'd be getting the exact same fabric result, but you wouldn't have those vertical lines of color. You're gonna have a completely reversible single color fabric. Feels the exact same, it's the same weight. There's no difference in how it feels, just how it looks. Now, one other tip that I wanna show you in brioche is how to use a lifeline. So brioche stitch will be one of the more difficult stitches if you drop a stitch and it ladders down, to try and hook it back up in pattern, because you're basically trying to work both of these 2 different sides of the fabric as one, and it's quite confusing and can be a little bit frustrating or defeating if you're a new brioche knitter and you're trying to fix a dropped stitch. So anytime you have a pattern like brioche or lace knitting, anything that's gonna not be very intuitive if you're having to fix a dropped stitch, a good rule of thumb is to use what we call a lifeline. And a lifeline is just exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of an insurance policy in your knitting, which is we're going to take a break. We're going to stop working the fabric. I've knit 3.5 inches here or so, and every time I put a lifeline in, I think of it as banking all the work below that I've done, because we're going to put this lifeline in through this current round that we're on and then keep knitting. And so if I had 6 inches, you would see this white yarn going through one row of my knitting. And beyond my lifeline, if I made a mistake and I really messed up my fabric and I couldn't fix it, I could just take my whole needle out and rip back, and I'd only have to rip back as far as the lifeline that I put in, and then I could put my needle back around all the stitches where the lifeline is and continue up from there. So it's just a safety precaution, especially when you're working in patterns that are difficult to fix mistakes. So the simple lifeline's really, really simple technique. You basically just stop what you're doing. You drop your working yarn, you thread some yarn, some waste yarn on a tapestry needle, and you're gonna run it through all your stitches. Just whatever's on the needle is what you're gonna run it through. So in brioche, we're gonna run it through these double stitches and the single stitches like this. I like to use these angled tapestry needles, and you can kind of go in sections. Sometimes it's easier to do a lifeline by pulling your needle out because the needle doesn't take up space in the stitches. So I'm basically more or less just running my lifeline right along the circular needle all the way through. So I'm putting it through, and you can do a few stitches at a time like this, all the way around. Like this. And I'm not going to do the whole thing right now, but for demonstration purposes, if you can imagine, you can see now that we have this lifeline parallel to your needle all the way around, through all your stitches. And on the next round following a lifeline, you want to be just a little careful in that you're not actually knitting the lifeline. You're sort of ignoring it. So you see I have my lifeline in here. I'm going to continue working in brioche. I'm in the knit round or round 1 of the pattern. So I'm just making sure that when I go in and knit that, I'm not actually going under the lifeline like that, but I'm going through the stitch and ignoring the lifeline. So I'm going to knit those 2 together, bring the yarn forward, slip 1, again, ignoring the lifeline, go into 2, not catching the lifeline, knit those, bring yarn forward, slip 1, and I do this all the way around, and I'll show you what it looks like after I finish. You can see how rhythmic this stitch is. Kind of has a nice pace to it once you get the hang of it. And so you can see now that as I was to continue working up, this lifeline would just look like sort of like a dotted line all the way around at any given point in my fabric. You can put as many of these in as you want. If you're very fastidious, you could put them in every single inch and know that you would never have to do more than that if you made a mistake. You could just do one at the halfway point to your project. It kind of all comes down to your personal risk tolerance. The other thing that's really cool and geeky about lifelines, there's an easier way to put them in, but it only really works if you have interchangeable needles. You can see I'm working on a regular circular here. But some interchangeable needles, there's a couple styles of interchangeable needles. Some click like this, and others screw on and have a little hole at the base of their needle. And one really cool way to do a lifeline if you're working with one of those needles is you can thread, I use dental floss because it's really fine. You can thread that dental floss. Imagine that I have a small hole in my needle right here. That would be if I was using a circular with a screwing interchangeability. You can just use your knitting needle basically as your tapestry needle. So if you can find a way to get that lifeline attached to the base of your needle, and then you just work your whole round, you're drawing the lifeline through all the stitches when you work one round. So it's a kind of a speedier way to do it. I've even seen people using like painter's tape. I would not recommend any other type of tape. You never want to get anything adhesive on your needles because that's just a recipe for frustration. You don't want your yarn to be sticking. But if I took my lifeline, I could do this with floss, or I'm using a fingering weight yarn here, and I just put a little bit of blue tape on my needle like this. And nice thing about painter's tape is it's not going to leave any residue behind. And if I just knit with this little affixed lifeline all the way around, it would be doing exactly what I've been doing here. I'd be pulling the lifeline behind me as I was going. So that's a fun shortcut to do a lifeline, but you don't need to do anything fancy other than what I've just done here with a tapestry needle and a length of waste yarn to get your lifeline. And lifelines come out just as easily as they are put in. You know, once you get to a second lifeline, you know you don't need to worry about the first one. You can just pull them right out of the fabric, and it looks perfectly normal. And that's brioche knitting in the round using 2 colors or 1 color.